In the heart of a lush green land stood the peaceful village of Dambara. The people of this village lived in harmony, sharing in each other's joys and sorrows like one big family. Birds sang sweet songs in the morning, children played freely under the sun, and neighbors looked out for one another. Dambara was a place where respect, tradition, and kindness flowed like the river that ran through it. Everyone knew everyone, and peace was the rhythm of life. In this village lived a young woman named Kisa. She was the kind of person whose presence could calm a storm. Gentle, humble, and strikingly beautiful, Kisa's heart was even more beautiful than her face. She greeted everyone with a warm smile, helped the elderly carry water, played with the children, and always listened with patience. People often said she was like the morning sun, soft, radiant, and full of hope. Everyone admired her, not just for her outer beauty, but for the goodness in her soul. Kisa was raised by her mother, Ireya, a quiet and wise woman who was respected by all in Dambara. Ireya was a herbalist, known far and wide for her healing hands and gentle heart. After losing her husband many years ago, she poured all her love and strength into raising Kisa. She taught her daughter the ways of nature, the secrets of healing, and most importantly, how to carry love and kindness, even in a world that sometimes lacked it. Together, they lived a simple life filled with peace, wisdom, and love, a life that seemed untouched by the cruelty of the world. But little did they know, a storm was quietly brewing. Dambara was a village full of peace, but even the calmest waters sometimes hide dark storms beneath. Among the villagers lived a man named Daho, a hunter whose name echoed through every corner of the land, not with admiration, but with fear. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and walked with the pride of a lion. Daho was known for his strength in the forest. He could kill a wild boar with one shot, outrun a leopard, and return from dangerous hunts with trophies that made others tremble. But behind his hunting skills was a heart full of arrogance and cruelty. He boasted about his strength, insulted the weak, and looked down on anyone who didn't bow to his pride. While many feared him, few respected him. He ruled his world with intimidation, and no one dared to challenge him. One day, Daho spotted Kisa at the village stream. She was helping an old woman carry a water pot, her face glowing with kindness, her soft laughter dancing in the air. That moment, something dark sparked in Daho's heart. It wasn't love, it was desire, control, and the hunger to own something beautiful and pure. He watched her quietly, his eyes burning with possessiveness. Kisa, unaware of his gaze, walked away gently, like a soft breeze passing by. But Daho had already made up his mind. He wanted her, and he would have her, no matter what it took. The very next day, Daho stormed into Ireya's compound, his voice echoing like thunder. He stood tall before Kisa's mother and declared, not asked, that he was taking Kisa as his wife. He didn't speak with kindness or respect. He didn't bring gifts or offer humble words like the old tradition required. Instead, he made demands, his eyes full of threat. Ireya, startled and shaken, tried to speak, to explain that her daughter deserved a gentle man, not a violent one. But Daho slammed his fist on the wooden bench, his voice turning sharp and cold. No one refuses Daho, he growled. If Kisa is not mine, then I will make sure no man dares to touch her. Ireya's heart sank. She looked at her daughter, who stood behind her, frightened and confused. Kisa's eyes pleaded with her mother silently, but Ireya could see the danger rising like smoke. She knew what Daho was capable of. He had burned a man's hut just for insulting him once. He had injured a boy for stepping on his shadow. If she said no, Daho might harm Kisa, or worse, destroy their peace forever. The fear twisted Ireya's heart. She felt helpless, like a mother watching a lion circle her lamb, unable to protect it. With trembling hands and a heavy soul, Ireya nodded, not out of acceptance, but out of fear. The villagers heard about it the next day, how Daho had won Kisa like a prize, how Ireya had agreed. But no one spoke of the fear behind her eyes, the sorrow in her silence. Kisa, the gentle flower of Dambara, was about to be planted in the soil of cruelty. The village, once full of peace, could not see the storm that had already entered one home, a storm that would grow darker with each passing day. The day of Kisa's marriage was supposed to be a day of joy, music, and dancing, but in her heart, there was only silence. The drums beat loudly, the villagers gathered, and food was shared, but Kisa's eyes held no happiness. Her smile was forced, her spirit already broken before the journey had even begun. Daho stood beside her like a king claiming his throne, proud and loud, showing off his new bride like a trophy he had hunted from the forest. People clapped, but their claps were hollow. Deep down, everyone knew the kind of man Daho was, but no one had the courage to speak. Fear had sealed their mouths. As Kisa stepped into her new home, she hoped, just for a moment, that things might not be as bad as they seemed. But it didn't take long for those hopes to shatter. The home, instead of being a place of love and laughter, turned into a cage. Daho, the fierce hunter, now treated his wife like a captured animal. The sweet words he had spoken during the wedding were gone. In their place came harsh orders, angry shouts, and cruel silence. Kisa couldn't laugh. She couldn't breathe freely. She lived in constant fear, walking on eggshells, unsure what would make Daho angry next. At first, it was just his voice, loud, sharp, always accusing her of one thing or another. He didn't like the way she cooked. He didn't like her speaking too softly. He didn't like her greeting other men, even elders. Slowly, his possessiveness grew like a dark cloud, covering every part of Kisa's life. He locked her inside the house when he went hunting. He watched her every move. He questioned every smile, every glance, every breath she took. Kisa felt herself shrinking, her soul folding inwards, her light dimming day by day. Then came the first slap. It was sudden, sharp, and unexpected. She had only asked if he wanted more soup, but his hand flew across her face, and everything inside her froze. That was just the beginning. After that, the beatings became frequent. Sometimes he would hit her for no reason at all, because the sun was too hot, because his hunt went wrong, or because he simply wanted to remind her who had the power. He didn't just hurt her behind closed doors. Daho had no shame in turning her pain into a public display. One day, in the village square, Daho dragged Kisa by her arm and slapped her hard in front of the elders. The people gasped, women covered their mouths, and children looked away. But no one stepped forward. No one dared. They all feared Daho's wrath more than they cared about Kisa's pain. The same people who once praised her beauty and kindness now watched her suffer in silence. Some turned their heads, others whispered behind their backs, but no one helped. Kisa became the woman everyone pitied in silence, but abandoned in action. Her mother Iya cried every night, helpless and broken, watching her only child disappear into the shadows of pain. The once bright and joyful girl of Dambara was now a prisoner in her own home, beaten, bruised, and silenced by a man who saw her not as a wife, but as property. And yet, deep within her, a small spark still remained, a spark that pain could not kill, a spark that one day karma would ignite into a fire. The village of Dambara, once filled with cheerful songs and warm greetings, now carried a heavy silence. Whispers floated in the air like smoke, moving from house to house, but no one spoke openly. Behind closed doors, the villagers murmured about Kisa's pain. They talked about the bruises they saw on her arms, the limp in her walk, the sadness in her eyes. Everyone knew what was happening, but no one had the courage to confront Daho. He was too feared, too powerful, and too unpredictable. People feared that speaking out would bring Daho's wrath upon them or their families, so they kept their voices low and their heads down. The same villagers who once admired Kisa now avoided her gaze. Some pitied her silently, others shook their heads, saying, "It is not our business." A few women cried quietly when they saw her walk past with her head bowed, her spirit clearly broken, but not one of them dared to knock on her door and ask if she was okay. Daho had made everyone afraid, and fear made even the kindest hearts turn cold. The silence of the village screamed louder than words, and Kisa was left to suffer alone. Day by day, she faded more and more. Her once bright eyes turned dull. Her laughter, which used to fill the air like sweet music, disappeared. She moved like a shadow, quiet, slow, and invisible. The strong, cheerful Kisa had become a ghost of her former self, locked in a world of pain and silence. Her soul cried, but no one heard. Her heart bled, but no one saw. The Kisa the village once loved was no longer there. All that remained was a shell, bruised and fragile, trying to survive each day under Daho's cruelty. Back in her small hut, Iya, her mother, could feel her child's pain even before she saw it. A mother always knows. Iya wept every night, not just for her daughter, but for her own helplessness. She wanted to fight back, to scream, to drag her daughter away from that evil man's house. but she had no strength, no power against Daho. Still, she did not give up completely. She turned to the only hope she had left, her ancestors. Each night, Iya lit a candle, placed herbs on her mat, and sat quietly in prayer. She whispered ancient words, calling on the spirits of their forefathers to protect her daughter. She poured her tears into the earth and begged the unseen forces to send justice. "Let the earth see this pain. Let the sky hear my cry," she would whisper with trembling lips. Iya believed in the strength of the spirits, and deep in her heart, she knew that no evil lasts forever. There was a strange feeling growing inside her, a sense that something was coming, a storm, a change. She didn't know when or how, but she could feel it in her bones. Something was shifting in the wind. The spirits were listening, Karma was watching, and though the village remained silent, the universe had begun to stir. Because no cruelty goes unnoticed forever, and no tear falls without an answer. The silence would not last forever. Something was about to change. The sun had barely risen when chaos struck the village square. Birds flew from the trees as loud shouting echoed through the air. People rushed from their homes, children peeked from behind their mothers, and whispers turned into gasps. Daho, drunk and filled with rage, stormed into the village square like a wild beast. His eyes were red, his steps unstable, and his voice roared like thunder. In his grip was Kisa, dragged like a sack of grain, her arms bruised and her face filled with terror. Her clothes were torn, her feet bare, and her tears flowed freely. Yet again, she was being punished for something she hadn't done. This time, he accused her of looking at another man, an accusation born from his madness and jealousy. The villagers stood frozen. Some covered their mouths in shock. Others turned their eyes away, too ashamed to witness the cruelty. But no one stepped forward. Daho raised his hand high and struck Kisa so hard she fell to the ground. He pulled her up again and beat her without mercy, his fists, his kicks, his anger pouring out like a storm. The village square became a stage of horror. The same square where children once played and elders shared stories now echoed with the cries of a broken woman. Just then, a strong voice cut through the air. "Enough!" It was Elder Nkomo, the oldest and most respected leader in Dambara. His white beard danced in the wind, and his walking stick hit the ground with authority. He stepped forward, his eyes burning with fury. "Daho, you are not a man. You are a coward who beats a woman to prove your strength." For a moment, the crowd held its breath. Would Daho stop? Would he listen to the elder? But Daho only laughed, a cruel and mocking sound. He wiped the sweat from his face and spat on the ground. "Old man," he sneered, "go back to your hut. You cannot tell me what to do with my wife. She is mine, and I will treat her how I want." Elder Nkomo shook his head slowly, a sadness deep in his eyes. "You have brought shame upon yourself, Daho. The spirits of this land are watching. You will not escape their judgment." But Daho waved his hand and walked away, leaving Kisa collapsed on the dusty ground, barely breathing. Blood stained her lips. Her arms trembled and her body was too weak to move. A loud cry pierced the air. Iya, her mother, came running through the crowd, tears pouring from her eyes. She fell to her knees beside her daughter, cradling her gently, weeping into her bruised face. The villagers watched in silence, guilt burning in their hearts. But still, none moved to help. That day was burned into the memory of Dambara forever. It was not just a day of pain, it was a day of shame. A day when everyone saw evil in its rawest form and chose fear over courage. But the spirits had seen too. The ancestors had witnessed everything. And from that moment, a path began to open, one that would lead to justice, one that would make even the mighty Daho fall. Karma had heard the cries, and her footsteps were drawing near. The days passed, but the wounds in Dambara did not heal. The whispers grew quieter, but the shame still hung in the air like a dark cloud. Kisa remained hidden in her mother's hut, her body bruised and her spirit even more broken. Iya tended to her with tears and herbs, but what Kisa needed most was something no medicine could give: justice. The villagers carried on with their daily lives, pretending everything was normal, though the guilt of silence haunted many hearts. Then one evening, as the sun melted into the hills, a strange figure walked into Dambara. His clothes were dusty, his sandals worn, and his back slightly bent from years of travel. He held a carved walking stick, and a faded hood covered most of his face. No one knew where he came from, but his eyes, those deep, ancient eyes, held a strange power, like he had seen many lifetimes. His name was Bulo, an old traveler and storyteller who claimed to have walked through deserts, danced in royal courts, and spoken with spirits in hidden caves. Children followed him with curiosity, and the elders gave him a seat under the big baobab tree. He didn't speak much at first, just observed. But soon, he began asking questions about the village, about its people, about the silence that hung like a ghost in the air. And then, one day, he saw it with his own eyes. Daho, in his usual rage, yelling at a young boy who had accidentally brushed against him. The villagers froze, holding their breath, fearing another display of Daho's cruelty. Bulow stood quietly in the corner, watching. He did not interrupt, did not shout. But when Daho walked away, proud and boastful, Bulow slowly rose to his feet and walked to the center of the village square. His voice, though old, carried weight. It was calm, but strong, like a drumbeat echoing in the hearts of the people. "I have seen many things," he began, "but never have I seen a man so proud of hurting the weak." The villagers looked at him curiously, unsure of what he meant. "Let me tell you a truth I have learned from the spirits and the winds," Bulow continued, raising his walking stick. "A man who raises his hand unjustly shall have it twisted by fate. The same hand that strikes the innocent shall one day beg for mercy. His pride will crumble like dust, and his name will be spat upon by even the birds." A silence fell over the crowd. Some people nodded slowly, others exchanged glances, but many just shook their heads and walked away, brushing off his words as old man's talk. "What does this stranger know?" some muttered. "He is just a tired traveler telling empty stories." But not everyone ignored him. Erea, who had been sitting quietly under a tree, felt a chill run down her spine. There was something about Bulow's voice, something ancient and powerful. Her heart beat faster, and she whispered under her breath, "The spirits are speaking." She went to Bulow later that evening, offering him food and water. She asked him quietly, "What do you really see?" Bulow looked at her with calm eyes and replied, "The river of pain has flowed too long, but every river meets an ocean. Daho's ocean is near." Erea felt both fear and hope. Something was coming, something powerful, and she knew now more than ever. Karma was no longer asleep. It had already taken its first steps toward Daho. The days turned slowly in Dambara, and though the wounds on Kisa's body began to fade, the pain in her heart still lived. But her mother Erea, strong and wise, would not let her daughter remain in darkness. Every day, Erea treated Kisa's bruises with special herbs, roots, and oils. But more than that, she poured love into her daughter's soul through gentle words, warm meals, and stories of strong women who had risen from pain. Slowly, like a flower after a storm, Kisa began to lift her head again. It started with small steps. One morning, Kisa stepped outside the hut to feel the sun on her face. Another day, she helped her mother grind herbs. Then, she began to ask questions about each leaf, each root, and how it healed pain. Erea saw the spark returning to her daughter's eyes and knew it was time to teach her everything she knew. Day by day, Kisa learned the secrets of healing, how to make pain-soothing oils, how to ease fevers, how to strengthen the heart with bitter bark and honeyed roots. But Erea was not only teaching her herbs, she was planting courage, resilience, and power into her spirit. Soon, women from the village began visiting Erea's hut for medicine and advice. But now, it was Kisa who met them at the door. With calm hands and a gentle smile, she offered them healing, hope, and comfort. These women looked at her with wonder. Not long ago, she had been the bruised and broken wife, and now she was the healer, standing tall with quiet strength. Word spread softly among the women of Dambara. Behind closed doors and in quiet corners they whispered, "Kisa is rising, Kisa is healing." Some came just for herbs, but others came for something deeper, for courage, for guidance, for the strength they had buried for years. Kisa began to notice their hidden pain, the sadness in their eyes, the nervous way they spoke, the bruises they tried to hide. She understood without asking, because she had lived their pain too. One evening, a woman named Yuma, who had been silent for years, came to Kisa and cried in her arms. "I thought I was alone," she said. Kisa held her tightly and replied, "You are never alone again." That was the beginning. More women came, not just for healing, but to learn. Kisa began to teach them what her mother had taught her, how to make healing salves, how to speak with strength, how to walk without fear. They gathered secretly, under trees by the riverbank, in quiet huts. It was not just a group, it was a movement. A sisterhood was forming. Kisa was no longer a victim. She was a symbol of hope. Her scars had turned into strength. Her tears had watered courage. She had found her voice, and in doing so, she helped others find theirs. The men of the village didn't notice at first, but something powerful was rising beneath the surface. The same woman they had once seen as weak was now standing like a flame in the night, lighting the hearts of others. And though Daho still walked with pride, he did not see that his greatest mistake was already shaping his downfall, for the strength he tried to crush had become the fire that would one day burn his throne of cruelty to ash. Kisa was no longer the broken wife. She was becoming a warrior of healing, and the winds of change had already begun to blow across Dambara. One hot morning in Dambara, Daho, still filled with arrogance, picked up his spear and went deep into the forest to hunt. He walked with his usual pride, believing he was still the strongest man in the land. He had no idea that karma had already started to follow him, like a shadow. That day, the forest was unusually quiet. The birds did not sing, and the wind felt heavy. But Daho, blinded by his ego, did not sense the warning in the air. He spotted a massive wild buffalo in the distance and smirked to himself. "This will prove again that I am still the king of the forest," he muttered. Without hesitation, he raised his spear and charged. But what he didn't realize was that this buffalo was not like the others. It was fierce, wild, and angry. As Daho threw his spear, the buffalo charged faster, its hooves thundering against the earth like drums of war. Daho tried to escape, but it was too late. The beast rammed into him with brutal force, tossing him like a rag. His arm was crushed under the weight of its attack, the bone shattered into pieces. The proud hunter screamed in pain, rolling on the ground, helpless and terrified, just like those he had once hurt. The forest that once echoed with his victorious roars now carried only his cries of agony. Hours later, villagers found him crawling back toward the edge of Dambara, bloody, broken, and barely conscious. The mighty hunter who once walked with his chest high now limped with shame and pain. His right arm, the one he had used to beat Kisa, hung uselessly by his side. The herbalist tried to treat him, but nothing could fully heal the damage. His hunting days were over. His strength was gone. At first, people came to see him, curious about what had happened. But soon, even that stopped. The same villagers who once feared his anger now looked at him with pity or simply turned away. They remembered how he had mocked them, how he had humiliated his wife in front of their eyes. Now, no one rushed to greet him. No one offered him help. Daho sat in front of his hut day after day, bitterness eating him from the inside. He watched silently as the people who once bowed to him walked past without a word. He saw the women of the village gathering around Kisa, laughing, learning, and growing stronger. It burned him inside, but he was powerless. The once mighty Daho had become a shadow of himself, forgotten and ignored. His pride had turned into humiliation. His throne of fear had crumbled into dust. Children no longer ran from him. They barely noticed him. Men no longer praised him. They shook their heads in silence. His crippled arm was now a symbol of his downfall. Every time he looked at it, he was reminded of the pain he had caused and the price he had paid. And somewhere deep in his heart, Daho began to understand. What he had done to others had come back to him, not from swords, not from men, but from the same fate he once laughed at. Karma had struck, not with words, but with force. And the man who had beaten a woman like an animal had now been brought to his knees by nature itself. The once mighty Daho, who had terrorized the village with his strength and arrogance, now sat at the edge of Dambara like a broken shell. His crippled arm hung uselessly, and his spirit had been crushed more deeply than his bones. Days turned into weeks, and the pain of his injury was soon overtaken by the pain of hunger and rejection. He could no longer hunt, no longer work, and no longer provide for himself. Pride had no place in his stomach, so he swallowed it and began begging. He would limp from house to house, asking for food, but the villagers only gave him cold stares. Some turned their backs. Others gave him a few scraps out of pity, but even that didn't last long. They remembered every cruel word he had ever said, every blow he had landed on Kisa, every moment he had mocked others with his strength. Now, the fear they once had was gone. All that remained was disgust and silence. One day, desperate and dirty, Daho dragged himself to the gates of Kisa's healing center, the same center that now stood tall and vibrant, filled with women and men who had once suffered in silence. There were herbs drying on the windows, laughter echoing from within, and the air smelled of healing oils and hope. Kisa stood at the doorway, dressed in a simple cloth, her head high, her eyes calm, her spirit glowing like never before. Daho looked at her, his voice shaking. "Kisa, please, forgive me. Take me back. I have nothing." But Kisa did not move. She looked at the man who had once beaten her like a wild animal in front of everyone, the same man who had torn her soul and crushed her dreams. Her heart no longer feared him. She had healed, and healing had turned her pain into power. Without a single tear or a raised voice, she replied softly but firmly, "You chose your path. Now walk it alone." Daho tried to push further, shouting and demanding. He wanted sympathy. He wanted the past erased. But it was too late. Elder Nkomo, who had once warned him long ago, stepped forward. The villagers gathered around to witness what would become the final chapter in Daho's downfall. Elder Nkomo raised his hand and spoke with authority. "A man who brings destruction into a home has no place in it again. Kisa owes you nothing. You are not welcome here." The villagers nodded in agreement. There was no anger in their eyes, only truth. Daho stood frozen, humiliated once more. But this time, it was final. He was banished. Not by punishment, but by justice. He was no longer feared, no longer respected. He was simply a man who had destroyed his own destiny with his own hands. As Daho stumbled away, Kisa turned back to her center. Inside, women were mixing herbs, teaching young girls, sharing stories of strength. What had started as her mother's healing hut had now become the heart of Dambara's hope. People came from other villages to learn, to heal, and to grow. Kisa had not only survived, she had transformed. Her name was now spoken with honor. Her scars had become her crown. And as for Daho, he faded into the shadows, forgotten by most, remembered only as a warning, proof that karma never sleeps, and those who beat others down will one day be crushed by the weight of their own cruelty. Daho, once the proud and feared hunter of Dambara, had now become a shadow of his former self. After being banished from Kisa's home, he wandered from one nearby village to another, dragging his injured arm and broken pride along with him. He hoped that somewhere, someone would remember him as the mighty hunter he used to be and offer him comfort. But everywhere he went, the stories of his cruelty had already arrived before him. People looked at him with cold eyes, whispering behind their hands, "That's the man who used to beat his wife in front of the whole village. Look at him now." No one offered him shelter. No one welcomed him with open arms. Even the elders in neighboring villages shook their heads in disappointment. Some gave him leftover food just to send him away. Others shut their doors in his face. He tried to tell his side of the story, tried to make excuses, but the people had heard enough. They remembered the screams, the bruises, the shame he had brought upon Kisa and the village of Dambara. Now, fate had turned the tables, and Daho was learning what it felt like to be helpless, powerless, and unwanted. Days turned into weeks, and Daho's body grew weaker. His clothes were torn, his feet blistered, and hunger became his constant companion. He began sitting by dusty roadsides with his hands stretched out, begging for coins, scraps, or even a kind word. But all he received were empty stares. The once mighty man who used to walk with pride now sat with his head bowed in shame. He was not just suffering physically, he was being eaten alive by regret. But by then, it was too late. His redemption had come too late, and no one was willing to offer him a second chance. Back in Dambara, a different story was unfolding. Kisa's healing center had grown into something far greater than anyone had imagined. What started as a small herbal hut became a place of hope, strength, and transformation. Women from nearby villages traveled just to learn from her. Her story of suffering, survival, and empowerment spread far and wide. People began to see her not just as a healer, but as a symbol of resilience. The village council, moved by her wisdom, leadership, and compassion, held a special gathering under the baobab tree. Elders, women, and youth came together to decide something that would change the history of Dambara. The council unanimously agreed to appoint Kisa as the head of the newly formed Women's Guild of Dambara, a council that would empower women, protect the vulnerable, and teach the next generation the value of respect, dignity, and strength. When Kisa stood to accept the honor, the entire village clapped and cheered. There were tears in some eyes and pride in others. She didn't need revenge to win. Her dignity, her courage, and her healing heart had brought her more than justice. She had become a beacon of light in a place that once held so much darkness. Far away, Daho heard the whispers of her rise through passing travelers. He sat in the dust, listening to stories of the woman he had once tried to break, now standing tall, honored by the same village that had once feared him. But no one looked back to offer him redemption. The world had moved on, and Daho was left behind as nothing more than a warning written in dust, proof that the cruelty you give will always come back to you when you least expect it. One bright morning, as the sun rose gently over the hills of Dambara, Kisa walked quietly through the familiar path that led to her mother Erea's grave. The birds sang softly, and the wind carried the scent of blooming herbs, plants that Erea once used in her healing work. Kisa's eyes welled with tears, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. She knelt beside the grave, her fingers gently tracing the carved stone. "Mama," she whispered, "you gave me strength when I had none. You gave me wisdom when the world tried to silence me. And now I stand because of you." Her heart was full of memories, of the times when she sat beside her mother, learning about herbs, listening to her stories about ancestors, and receiving the quiet strength that only a mother could give. Erea had not only taught Kisa to heal wounds with roots and leaves, but also to heal hearts with kindness and courage. Though she was no longer here in body, her spirit lived on through Kisa's every step, every word, and every life she touched. As Kisa stood up, she looked toward the village, where her healing center bustled with hope and joy. Women laughed, children played, and the air was full of life. Kisa had become more than a survivor. She had become a symbol of power, of light, of transformation. The girl who was once beaten in public now walked with her head held high, respected by all, honored by many. And just beyond the village, down a lonely path near the market's edge, sat a man no one noticed anymore. His clothes were torn, his face was tired, and his eyes held the weight of regret. It was Daho, once the proud, fierce hunter, now a forgotten figure begging for crumbs. His arm still hung uselessly by his side, a painful reminder of the fate he couldn't escape. People passed by him without a glance, without pity. His name, once spoken in fear, was now only remembered in whispers of warning. As the camera slowly panned from Kisa's radiant face to Daho's pitiful form, the narrator's voice echoed across the scene like a whisper from the ancestors themselves. "When you treat a woman like an animal, remember, karma watches with the eyes of the ancestors." The wind seemed to carry those words into every corner of Dambara. It was not just a story, it was a lesson, a warning, a truth. That cruelty never hides from justice. That pain inflicted on the innocent will one day return, tenfold. Kisa turned back one last time to her mother's grave and smiled softly. She knew her journey was far from over. There were still many lives to touch, many hearts to heal, and many voices to uplift. But she also knew that her story had already planted a seed in the hearts of every woman who had ever suffered in silence. A seed of strength, a seed of hope. And as the story faded to silence, one image remained burned in the mind of every viewer. Kisa standing tall in the sunlight, her spirit shining brighter than ever, while behind her, in the shadows, Daho sat forgotten and broken, the echo of his own actions chasing him through every breath. If this story touched your heart, then take a moment to reflect. How many women like Kisa are suffering in silence, their pain unseen, their voices unheard? Let this tale be more than just a story. Let it be a wake-up call. No one deserves to be treated like an animal. Every woman deserves respect, love, and dignity. And to those who think they can harm others without consequence, remember, karma never forgets. It may come slowly, but it always arrives. If you felt the pain, the strength, and the power in Kisa's journey, please don't let this message end here. Like this video, share it with others, and let the world hear Kisa's story. You never know who might need to hear this today. And if you believe in more stories that bring life lessons, truth, and inspiration, then subscribe to our channel and be part of this journey. Your support helps us keep telling these powerful stories that deserve to be heard. Thank you so much for watching. Stay kind, stay strong, and always remember, what you give to the world always finds its way back to you.